Welcome back to Shrinking It Down, Mental Health Made Simple. I'm Gene Beresin.
And I'm Steve Schlozman. And today we actually have a colleague with us.
I'm Ellen Braaten. It's
One
nice
of-
to be
one
here.
of us at
Yes.
the Clay Center. So this is talk about ridiculously simple. This is ridiculously complicated, but really complicated. Today we're going to be talking about the divisiveness, the polarization, kind of the...
Wait. Are things polarized? Like in the country, you mean? Like people don't agree? Because have you heard that?
Well, it's occurred to me that that's the case. You know what?
I hear tell.
I hear tell that people are having a little bit of differences now and then. You know, it's vitriolic. That's a big word. That means it's so brutal in many, many homes and households and among friends. You know, so what's your experience, Ellen?
You already know my experience.
I already know your experience.
So I'm getting ready for the holidays now, and my family, I feel in some ways, is sort of the American melting pot around our Thanksgiving table. Some of us are very strong Democrats. Some of us are very strong Republicans. Some are very strong independents. And as you know, my mother's dog was named Riley after Bill O'Reilly, which for some of us is a hard thing to cope with, and others think it's the best thing ever. Although I do have to say, the dog was a terrible misbehaved dog. She had to give him.
Is your dog an Irish Terrier?
No, she had to give him away. He was such a poorly behaved dog. He just never listened.
Well, chip off the old block.
Yeah, so I think it's tough to know any possible topic you could bring up is going to be offensive to someone at our dinner table.
So what's it like sitting around the table with people who are going to be offended or angry or what?
I think we all come, and this might be what sets us apart from other families that have a lot of arguing, because last year was a very stressful year right after the election. And I think that we all come with the idea that we love each other, and that politics are probably not the best thing for us to discuss. We spend a lot of time talking about other things, memories, and I think that's a really good way to cope with some of these things. Like, you have your own culture when you are there with the people you love and have spent time with. So we spend a lot of time joking, making fun of each other.
You don't fight? You don't fight about the politics?
We really didn't know. I mean, this remains to be seen. We
Well,
could talk in
it's
2 weeks
not,
and it could be
you
different.
just didn't fight. It was an active decision that you would talk about memories and you would avoid these topics. It sounds
I
like.
think it was an active decision on all of our parts. We don't see each other that often. I think we're all smart enough too to know that it's kind of a stupid way for us to spend our time arguing about things that we can't really control.
This is healthy in my view. I mean, because you all know where you're coming from, and you all have made this either conscious or unconscious decision to stay away from it. But if you look at the news, if you look at
And also, wait, you can't not look at the news. That's part of the issue.
Right.
Like it's
everywhere.
flying at you all the time.
It's everywhere. So, but people are angrier and more volatile and at each other's throats than I can't remember a time like this.
So this is worth actually bringing this back to mental health. It's not good for us. We know this.
It's
for a fact.
stressful.
There's a lot of good studies. This kind of vitriol at the dinner table or on the subway or on the media is actually really bad for us, but we're also programmed to pay attention to it. When one person's yelling at another person, you take notice. You can't afford not to take notice because it could involve you. So we're a little bit addicted to it, and that's actually driving this train. And so I think as the holidays approach, we got to find a way to acknowledge that we're a little bit hooked on it.
But before we even get to the holidays, I have a question. Why is this happening? I mean, look, I grew up in the 60s. I was, involved with all this kind of like really hot stuff that was happening. But even back then, I mean, there was a lot of, anger and violence and but there's something really different now than there was many years ago. And I'm wondering what's the difference and why is
I mean, that's an empirical question that we can only give a guess to, I think. But my guess, and it's what's similar about the 60s, I think, is that we all have a feeling that there's some kind of a loss of control, whether it is our environment, whether it is the fluidity of sexuality,
Our values.
our
values.
our values
Yeah.
are, and we don't really know what's happening. And I think that we sometimes go to politics, and my family is actually quite, like, we're very strong in our beliefs and well informed, but I think it's like we want something to believe in that we can feel like it's going to keep us steady, maybe even hopeful, although I don't see a lot of hope.
Well, there's all those studies that, once a group of people becomes larger than 25, you actually need a cohesive set of beliefs that hold them together. And so you lock on to certain beliefs and you decide, I will associate with the folks who think this and not with the folks who think that. And then the social media world and the media world in general locks people together.
One of the things that makes it different now is the instantaneous, digital news, or whatever you want to call it. But the tweeting, the instantaneous reactions, the responses are like lightning speed, and they're pervasive. They're everywhere. So do you think that's something that helps foster this division?
Oh, without question.
Oh, yeah.
It's both used
yeah.
to foster division, and it also does it even when it's not used, when it's not intended to do that. Look, I'm going to tell a brief story. I grew up, actually, you grew up in Wisconsin, right?
Right.
So I grew up in Kansas City, which,
God,
and
two
Midwesterners.
Jeez.
Most of the folks I grew up with were fairly right of center. Reagan spoke at my high school. I gave him a giant pencil. That was because I was on the student council.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
I stood up there on stage with him.
You have a picture of that?
I do. I was not a Reagan fan. One time, my buddies and I, who were not Reagan fans, stole all of the Democrat campaign signs and put them in the yard of our AP government teacher, who was very Republican. Great teacher. And that was like our prank, and he knew it was us.
Yeah.
Rather than get mad at us, he said, okay, look, that's funny, fine. But if you really don't agree with my beliefs, you got to write me a paper about why that is, and I want you to present it to the class.
Cool.
And we had like a discussion.
Cool.
And it wasn't hostile. It wasn't. He laughed. He said, "Fine, we're allowed to disagree, but you can't just disagree for the sake of disagreeing. You got to support your views."
Well, it's interesting because I used to watch William F. Buckley Jr., who was on the opposite side of the fence from me. What struck me about him was that he was just like that. I mean, he was so articulate. He was so interesting and so creative, but so thoughtful about it. And right now, I really don't think a lot of these arguments are filled with thoughtfulness or mindfulness.
You can't be thoughtful in a tweet.
Right.
So the
140 characters.
Although I do think there are thoughtful people on both sides of the political spectrum, and I think that actually brings me comfort, both to read both liberal thinkers and conservative thinkers. And I think that it's about thinking that's going to get us through this, not necessarily feeling, but sort of like relying on what works, what doesn't work, and the why, the justification as to why we're doing things.
Look, my best friend and I never vote the same. This year we went to London to see...
Your best friend from high school?
From high school, yeah. Went to see went to see The Who. And on stage, so we had spent the whole time hashing out our different political views, but our friendship goes way back. We were best men at each other's weddings. Like, we weren't going to let this thing kill our friendship. On stage, Daltrey and Townsend got in an argument about Brexit. So Townsend said, hey, this is a bad idea. Daltrey said, I think it's a pretty good idea. And we thought, those guys have been playing music for 50 years together, and they can still do this. Eric, you and I can be buddies.
And there's a new book out on the relationship between Henry Fonda and Jimmy Stewart.
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah.
And the same kind of thing. I mean, because Fonda was like this raging liberal, and Stewart was this conservative guy, but they were best buddies, and they did not let their political ideology kind of like mess up their friendship.
So I think that's, from a mental health perspective, that's what we need to model for our, we're about kids, right? So that's what we need to model for kids.
How does this affect kids? I mean, that's a really important thing for our audience. I mean, it has to affect our kids.
So right now we have only anecdotal data. I haven't seen any studies. They might be out there being done right now, but the anecdotal data I have, meaning the kids who come see me in the office, as well as my own kids, they're listening. They're listening. They're fed up. They're angry that we can't figure out a way to talk to each other in a nice way. They're irritated that people on TV can say things that they're not allowed to say in school. Like a lot of this stuff is just on both sides, by the way.
Yeah.
It's not a left or a right thing. They're just like adults are misbehaving. It makes them
But
angry.
they're also misbehaving too, because I know a lot of college kids, for example, that will actually not be friends with others who have positions on the other side of the fence. They won't even discuss things with each other. They won't even relate to each other, which is really awful because they feel dismissed and they don't feel like they're able to kind of like make connections.
I think part of it is that when things are stressful, we like to get things more in a more simple framework. And I think we're all feeling pretty stressed about lots of different things. And the news is not generally good for many different topics. And so being able to sort of think in categories in a very simplistic way feels kind of good to us. And so being able to get to, I think perspective taking is something that's lacking. And also most of the time people have beliefs different from ours. It's oftentimes comes from a good place. And it makes sense when we hear like, why do you believe differently than I do?
So you have to like actively put yourself in someone else's shoes.
Right.
So let's get some tips. So let's provide some tips before we come to our closing. What tips would we give to our viewers? Steve, you had a good one.
You put yourself in the other person's shoes actively, like really do it. Don't just do it as an exercise. Don't do it as a sarcastic exercise. Say, I'm going to try and imagine why you, who I love, who I've known forever, feel something so different from me. I'm going to try and articulate that, and you tell me if I get it right.
Yeah.
And along with that, I think, and this sounds so simple or silly maybe even, but to practice kindness. I mean, it's so easy for me to be enraged about a certain topic, but to think about like being kind is much more useful.
People listen more.
Right, exactly. Like, am I being kind in this? Am I even being kind to myself in the kinds of things that I'm doing? Or
otherwise
thinking?
it's just everyone's amygdala yelling at everyone's amygdala. Like it's just the limbic
right,
system.
exactly.
So
which is what it is. I mean, we feel
the
strongly
amygdala
about
is the
something.
seat of the
It's just rage, just
Rage.
fight,
Fight
no
or
language.
flight, fight or
You're
flight.
just revved up.
Okay.
And I also think too, since we're talking about holidays, oftentimes alcohol is part of that, and I think a lot of times this kind of physical response comes from not necessarily being in control. That's a good thing to sort of remember to indulge.
Actively, just keep it in mind.
Keep that in mind, because that is never it never tends to keep things quiet.
And understand, I guess, that humans, we love simplicity, but we do better with nuance. So like we're programmed to decide it's this or that. That's the way we're designed.
Well, you always say that part of our job is to make things simple, but it's also to make things people think more kind of complicated fashion.
But that doesn't come naturally to us as a species. So we have to get ourselves to
And
do
a lot of these arguments are really kind of too overly simplified. So try to be more nuanced, complicated, think of all the different options.
And not take it personally. This is
Oh,
not
that's an important
oftentimes, we feel sometimes when someone has a different viewpoint from our own that it's personalized, that they're saying something about us.
And all of this should reduce stress.
Yes.
Okay, and now it's time in our show for monumental mental health myths. This is the time where Herman will give us myths, hopefully about the topic in hand. So would you like to have this one, Steve?
Sure. Okay, so this one says, oh, this is interesting, because this is a myth.
Now, you've never seen this myth,
I have
you?
not, but I know the data around this. The holidays are a high-risk time for suicide. People say that, like this is the time when you start to see blog posts, articles, newspaper pieces.
People get really
all about
worried.
The
Yeah,
risk of
'cause they're so
suicide
stressful.
around the holidays.
And so what does the data show?
So the data shows that it's not the highest risk time. It's not that you shouldn't worry about it, but the American Society for Suicide Prevention, the CDC, many public health-oriented organizations have noted that actually the suicide peak is in the spring. It's March and April, and a little bit that has to do with what latitude you live at. The holidays are a time of loneliness. So it's when you want to connect and reach out to people. So it's not as if we're saying don't worry about your family members, especially if they have some kind of psychiatric challenge around the holidays. But it's not a suicide risk time. It's a time, though, to feel very left down and lonely. And there is some data that the feelings that are planted during the holidays declare themselves in the spring.
So the moral would be to make some connections,
Yeah,
to reach out.
yeah.
Okay.
Which is what you're supposed to do anyhow on holidays.
Right.
Or all the time, I guess.
Okay. Would you like to ask Herman to give me a myth?
Yeah.
Thanks,
Herman, give him that.
So, okay, here's the myth. Our kids aren't listening. It's just not true. The kids are actually listening. They're listening to a lot of stuff. They're listening to the news. They're listening to their, smartphones. They're on their apps. They're listening to each other. But most of all, they're really listening to parents and caregivers. I mean, they're listening to what we have to say because, after all, we are as parents, their ultimate role models, and they do listen. They may not respond. You may not think they're listening. They may be in the other room, but they're hearing the arguments. They're hearing the fights. They're hearing, and they're watching us. And so the fact is that they are listening. And what it means to me is that we have to be thoughtful about bringing our fight or flight responses down and be mindful of what we're saying and also what the ages of the kids are, because kids are listening from very, very young. They may not understand the words, but they understand the music.
Oh, my.
Yeah, exactly. And so even if they're not understanding what we're saying, they're understanding the emotional. And the anxiety that might come from that. But the other thing to think about is that they're also hearing us when we're having active, good discussions, when we're arguing in a way that actually comes to some sort of resolution, or where we're hearing someone else's point of view or integrating that. And so that's a good thing.
A good thing.
They are listening,
Right.
and that can be a good thing too.
So we need to pay attention to what we're doing because they're listening.
And how we do what we're doing.
And how we do it.
Yeah.
Well, thanks a lot for listening and watching, everybody. And if you have any comments, questions, you want to contribute, get in touch with us. I'm Gene Beresin.
And I'm Steve Schlozman.
And you?
Yeah, and I'm Ellen Braaten.
And we'll see you guys next time. Thanks.
See ya.